Mark's worn sneakers scuffed against the cracked pavement as he trudged home from school. His backpack hung loosely over one shoulder, the weight matching his mood. It was a typical day in their noisy neighborhood, a mix of honking cars, distant chatter, and the occasional bark of a dog. But Mark's thoughts were elsewhere. That morning, he had walked into the kitchen to find his mother sitting at the table, her eyes red and swollen. A crumpled rent notice lay in front of her, the stark black letters practically screaming their impending eviction. She quickly wiped her face and forced a smile when she noticed him, but it did little to mask the fear lingering in her gaze. Lost in thought, Mark rounded the corner near their local market and stopped abruptly. In front of him, an elderly man was struggling to lift several heavy grocery bags up a narrow staircase. The man's thin frame trembled with effort as he leaned heavily against the rail, his face twisted in concentration. A few passers-by glanced his way but kept walking, uninterested in offering help. Mark hesitated, his stomach nodding. People in this neighborhood always seemed to keep an eye on him. If he so much as looked at someone the wrong way, whispers would follow. "What's that boy up to now?" they'd murmur. He could almost hear it already. But as the old man's knees wobbled and one of the bags teetered precariously, Mark's resolve solidified. "Excuse me, sir," he called, stepping forward. "Need help with those?" The man startled slightly, his eyes darting toward Mark. For a moment, suspicion flickered across his lined face, but it was quickly replaced by a faint smile. "Well, if you're offering, young man, I sure could use a hand." Mark nodded and grabbed the bags. Their weight surprised him, he had to shift his stance to balance them properly. Without another word, he hoisted them up and started up the stairs. The old man followed behind, one hand gripping the rail tightly. "You don't see many kids helping strangers these days," the man said between labored breaths. "What's your name, son?" Mark kept his eyes on the stairs, his face flushing. "Just Mark," he mumbled. They reached the top, and Mark set the bags down carefully near the door. The man placed a firm hand on his shoulder, surprising Mark with his strength. "Thank you, Mark. It's not often you find a good heart like yours these days. You've done me a great kindness." Mark avoided his gaze, his discomfort evident. "It's nothing," he said quickly, taking a step back. I gotta go." The man's smile widened, his eyes squinting warmly. "Well, Mark," he called as Mark began to walk away, "you've got a good heart. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Mark hurried down the stairs, his ears burning. Compliments weren't something he heard often, and they always left him feeling exposed. He kept his head down as he navigated through the bustling streets, the weight of the encounter mingling with the anxiety that already plagued him. When he arrived home, the rent notice still sat ominously on the kitchen counter. His mother stood by the stove, stirring a pot of thin soup. The smell filled the small space, but it wasn't enough to mask the tension hanging in the air. "Hey, Ma," Mark said, dropping his backpack near the door. She turned, forcing another smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi, sweetheart. How was school?" Mark shrugged, pulling out a chair at the table. "It was fine." His eyes drifted to the notice again, and his chest tightened. He hated seeing her like this, shoulders hunched under the weight of worry she tried so hard to hide. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "Why don't you wash up?" Mark nodded but didn't move right away. Instead, he stared at the notice, the bold letters glaring back at him like a challenge. He clenched his fists under the table, a wave of frustration washing over him. They were always teetering on the edge, barely scraping by. And now, it seemed like they were about to lose even that fragile stability. That night, as Mark lay in his small, cramped room, he couldn't shake the image of his mother's weary face or the sound of the old man's voice thanking him. The juxtaposition of the two stirred something in him, a determination he hadn't felt before. He might not be able to fix everything, but he could do something. He had to. The next morning, Mark woke early, the memory of the rent notice propelling him out of bed. He grabbed his backpack and left the house quietly, not wanting to wake his siblings. The streets were quieter at this hour, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by a calm stillness. He made his way to the market, hoping to find some odd jobs that could bring in even a few dollars. As he passed the narrow staircase where he'd helped Mr. Howard the day before, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. The encounter, though brief, had left an unexpected mark on him. It reminded him that even small acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways he couldn't predict. Mark spent the morning offering his help to the vendors at the market. He carried crates, swept storefronts, and even helped an elderly woman bargain for a better price on a basket of fruit. The work was tiring, but it felt good to do something productive. By midday, he had earned enough to buy a loaf of bread and a carton of milk, not much, but it was something. When he returned home, his mother's eyes widened at the sight of the groceries. "Mark, where did you get the money for this?" "I did some work at the market," he said simply, setting the items on the counter. Her expression softened, and she pulled him into a quick hug. "Thank you, sweetheart. You didn't have to do that." Mark shrugged, his cheeks flushing. "I wanted to." That evening, as they shared a modest dinner, Mark felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as he listened to his siblings laugh and chatter, he realized that for them, he would do whatever it took to keep their family afloat. The morning sun struggled to cut through the thick, gray clouds as Mark sat on the worn steps of his family's small house, the rent notice still weighing heavily on his mind. He picked at the frayed edges of his backpack, his thoughts swirling with the growing pressure of their financial troubles. A low rumble broke his reverie, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. Mark's head snapped up. A sleek black SUV, its paint gleaming unnaturally bright in their gritty neighborhood, pulled up in front of the house. Mark frowned. Cars like that didn't belong here. His heart picked up speed as the door opened and a sharply dressed man stepped out. The stranger's tailored suit and polished shoes screamed wealth, a stark contrast to the chipped paint and cracked sidewalks that surrounded him. The man scanned the street briefly before his gaze landed on Mark. The man's lips curved into a polite smile as he approached. "You must be Mark," he said, his voice smooth and confident. He extended a hand. "I'm James Howard. My father told me about how you helped him yesterday." Mark hesitated, glancing at the hand before cautiously shaking it. "Is he okay?" he asked, his voice tentative. James's smile widened. "More than okay. He's been talking non-stop about how kind you were to help him with his groceries. You made quite an impression on him, and I wanted to stop by to offer my thanks personally." Mark shifted uncomfortably under James's steady gaze. "It was nothing," he muttered. "Just saw he needed help." James's expression softened. It wasn't nothing to him. Not many people take the time to look out for others these days, let alone someone they've never met. Reaching into his jacket pocket, James pulled out a sleek business card and held it out to Mark. "If you or your family ever need anything, don't hesitate to call me." Mark's hand hovered over the card for a moment before he finally took it. The weight of the glossy paper felt heavier than it should have. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, "Never accept handouts. People always expect something in return." He glanced at the card, the pristine print displaying James Howard and a number in neat black font. "Thanks, but we're fine," Mark said, his tone polite but firm as he shoved the card into his pocket. James's smile faltered for just a second, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face before it was replaced with warmth. "The offer stands, Mark. No strings attached. Sometimes we all need a little help." He gave a small nod and turned back toward the SUV. Mark watched as James climbed into the vehicle and drove away, the car's engine humming softly before it disappeared down the street. Left standing on the steps, Mark pulled the card from his pocket and stared at it. It felt like a lifeline, though he wasn't sure he could trust it. The card burned in Mark's pocket all day. At school, his mind wandered during lessons, his focus shifting between the rent notice at home and James's mysterious offer. By the time the final bell rang, he convinced himself it was nothing more than a rich man's attempt to ease his conscience. Still, curiosity nagged at him. Who was James Howard, really? And why would someone like him bother with someone like Mark? When Mark arrived home, the tension in the air was palpable. His mom stood by the sink, scrubbing at a dish with more force than necessary. Her tired eyes darted toward him as he stepped inside. "How was school?" she asked, her voice strained but trying to sound cheerful. Mark shrugged, setting his backpack down. "Same as always." "Any news on the rent?" Her shoulders sagged, and she turned off the faucet, drying her hands with a threadbare towel. "I spoke to Mr. Rodriguez again. He said he'd give us until Friday." After that, she trailed off, the weight of her unfinished sentence hanging in the air. Mark's jaw tightened. "We'll figure it out," he said, more to reassure her than because he believed it. She nodded, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. "I'm going to see if Mrs. Lopez has any extra hours at the diner. Don't wait up for me." After she left, the house felt eerily quiet. Mark pulled out James's card and studied it again. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the corner before tucking it away. He couldn't shake the voice in his head that said relying on someone else would only make things worse. The next morning, Mark found himself staring at the card again as he walked to school. His fingers traced the embossed lettering as questions buzzed in his mind. Did James mean what he said? Could he really help? By the time he reached school, Mark's resolve had only deepened. He would figure this out on his own. He couldn't risk his family's stability on a promise from someone he barely knew. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. That afternoon, as Mark walked home from school, he spotted the black SUV again. It was parked a few houses down, and James stood by the driver's side, leaning casually against the door. He straightened when he saw Mark approaching and offered a small wave. Mark's steps slowed, and his stomach knotted. He considered turning around, but James called out to him before he could decide. "Mark, can we talk for a second?" Reluctantly, Mark walked over. "What are you doing here?" he asked, unable to hide the suspicion in his voice. James chuckled. "Relax, I'm not stalking you. I just wanted to check in. I was in the area and thought I'd see how you were doing." Mark raised an eyebrow. "In the area?" James shrugged, an easy smile on his face. "Okay, maybe I went a little out of my way. But my father wouldn't let me hear the end of it if I didn't at least try to follow up with you." Mark frowned. "Why? What do you want from me?" James's smile faded, and he looked genuinely taken aback. "Nothing," he said earnestly. "I don't want anything, Mark. I just know what it's like to need help and not know who to turn to. If someone hadn't stepped in for me once, I wouldn't be where I am today." Mark's defenses softened slightly, but he still hesitated. "My mom wouldn't like this," he admitted. "She doesn't trust people who offer help." James nodded thoughtfully. "I get it. But the offer stands, whether you use it or not. Just know that it's there." For the first time, Mark saw a flicker of something in James's eyes that made him pause. Maybe it wasn't pity. Maybe it was understanding. Before Mark could say anything else, James climbed back into the SUV and drove off, leaving Mark standing on the sidewalk. As the car disappeared from view, Mark slipped the card back into his pocket, his mind buzzing with possibilities. For the first time, he wasn't sure if accepting help was such a bad idea after all. That night, the weight of the rent notice pressed heavily on Mark's mind, as though the piece of paper itself was physically crushing him. His mom tried to act as if everything was fine, humming softly while cooking a modest dinner, but her red-rimmed eyes and the tension in her voice told a different story. She barely touched her plate, and when she thought no one was looking, she glanced at the notice on the counter, her lips pressed tightly together. Mark's siblings, blissfully unaware of the gravity of their situation, played in the cramped living room. Their laughter echoed through the small house, a bittersweet reminder of the innocence Mark was desperate to protect. He envied their ignorance but also knew it was his responsibility to shield them from the storm brewing around them. After dinner, Mark lay on his thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling. His mind churned, replaying the events of the past few days. The memory of James Howard's polished business card weighed on him, even though it was tucked safely in his pocket. He could almost feel its edges digging into his skin, a tangible reminder of an option he hadn't yet dared to explore. What choice do I have? Mark thought, his chest tightening. He hated the idea of asking for help, of accepting charity, even if James had said there were no strings attached. His mother's voice echoed in his head, a warning born of years of hardship: don't trust anyone who offers something for free. But as the minutes stretched into hours and the shadows in the room deepened, Mark's resolve began to falter. The deadline for the rent was fast approaching, and with each passing day, the chances of finding a solution seemed to slip further from their grasp. His mom was doing everything she could, working extra shifts and cutting corners wherever possible, but it wasn't enough. Mark couldn't just sit back and watch their world fall apart. Finally, unable to bear the suffocating silence, Mark sat up and reached for his phone. His hands trembled as he pulled James's card from his pocket. The sleek design and embossed lettering seemed almost mocking in its perfection, a stark contrast to the worn and threadbare life he knew. Mark stared at the number printed neatly beneath James's name, his thumb hovering over the keypad. What if this makes things worse? The thought gave him pause, but then he remembered his mom's weary expression, the way she hid her tears earlier that evening. What if it doesn't? Taking a deep breath, Mark dialed the number. Each ring felt like an eternity, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything else. When the line finally connected, a familiar, steady voice greeted him. "Hello, this is James Howard." Mark's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't find his voice. He swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "It's Mark. I could use some help." James's tone shifted instantly, warm and reassuring. "Mark, I'm glad you called. Tell me what's going on." Mark hesitated, glancing toward the closed door of his mom's bedroom. He lowered his voice. We're behind on rent. My mom's trying her best, but it's not enough. I don't know what else to do." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Mark worried he'd made a mistake. But then James spoke, his words steady and deliberate. "I'll be there first thing in the morning. We'll figure this out together." Relief washed over Mark, though it was tempered by a lingering sense of unease. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You don't need to thank me, Mark," James replied. "Just get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow." As the call ended, Mark sat in the darkened room, clutching the phone tightly. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. The morning came too quickly, the pale light filtering through the curtains doing little to chase away the apprehension in Mark's chest. He woke early, his mind racing with thoughts of what James might say, or worse, what his mom might say when she found out. True to his word, James arrived promptly at 8 a.m. The sleek black SUV rolled to a stop outside their house, drawing curious glances from the neighbors. Mark stepped outside, his heart hammering as James climbed out of the car, a calm and collected presence amidst the chaos swirling in Mark's mind. "Good morning," James said with a small smile. "How are you holding up?" Mark shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets. I'm okay. Thanks for coming." James nodded, his gaze steady. "Of course. Let's talk inside." Mark hesitated, glancing back at the house. "My mom doesn't know I called you. She's not big on asking for help." James's expression softened. "I understand. Let's be respectful of that. I'll follow your lead." They entered the house quietly, the creak of the door alerting Mark's mom, who emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish rag. Her eyes widened when she saw James standing in the entryway. "Who's this?" she asked, her tone cautious. Mark swallowed hard, stepping forward. "This is James Howard. He's the son of the man I helped the other day. I called him last night." His mom's expression tightened, a mixture of suspicion and pride flickering across her face. She glanced at James, her gaze assessing. "And why are you here?" James met her gaze evenly. "Mrs. Daniels, I'm here because your son is an incredible young man. He helped my father when he didn't have to, and I want to return the favor. I'd like to help with your rent situation, and I'd also like to offer Mark some work. Honest pay for honest work." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't take charity." "It's not charity," James said gently. "Mark earned this. And the job offer is real. He'll be working for every penny." A tense silence filled the room as Mark's mom considered his words. Finally, she exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "But Mark, be careful. Don't let anyone take advantage of you." Mark nodded, a mixture of relief and determination flooding him. "I will, Ma. I promise." James offered a reassuring smile. "We'll start tomorrow, Mark. I'll pick you up at 7 a.m. As James left, Mark felt a strange mix of hope and apprehension. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were moving forward. The next morning, James arrived promptly in his sleek black SUV, his polished demeanor a stark contrast to the weathered homes lining Mark's neighborhood. Mark stood on the porch, nervously twisting the hem of his jacket as his mother hovered in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The tension was palpable, an invisible line of skepticism drawn between her and the man who had so graciously extended his hand to help. James stepped out of the vehicle and offered a warm smile. "Good morning, Mark. Are you ready to talk about a plan?" Mark glanced back at his mother, who gave him a small, reluctant nod. He took a deep breath and stepped down from the porch to meet James at the bottom of the stairs. They spoke quietly, Mark explaining their situation in hushed tones, his words punctuated by gestures toward the house and the weighty worry in his voice. James listened intently, his brow furrowing as Mark's story unfolded. When Mark finished, James nodded thoughtfully. "You're in a tough spot, no doubt about it. But I think we can work something out." "How?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with both hope and wariness. James smiled. "First things first, I'll cover the rent for the next month to give you and your family some breathing room." He held up a hand to stop Mark's protest. "This isn't charity, Mark. Consider it a loan, one you can repay when you're ready." Mark's mother stepped out onto the porch, her voice sharp as she interrupted. "And what do you expect in return?" James turned to her, his expression earnest. "Nothing except to see Mark succeed. I also own several properties and could use some help. Mark seems like a hard-working young man. If he's willing to put in the effort, I'd like to offer him a job. Honest pay for honest work." Mark's mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't need charity." James met her gaze without flinching. "It's not charity, ma'am. Mark earned this. Your son has already proven he's willing to step up when it matters. All I'm doing is giving him a chance to build on that." A tense silence settled over the porch. Mark's mother looked between James and her son, her features softening just slightly as she saw the quiet determination in Mark's eyes. Finally, she sighed and gave a curt nod. "All right. But Mark, be careful. Trust is earned, not given freely." Mark's chest swelled with a mix of relief and determination. "I will, Ma. I promise." Later that morning, Mark climbed into James's SUV, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The interior smelled of leather and carried an air of professionalism that felt foreign to Mark. As they drove, James explained the details of the job. "It's nothing glamorous," James said. "General upkeep at one of my apartment buildings. Fixing things, cleaning up, helping the property manager with whatever needs doing. You'll get paid weekly. It's hard work, but I think you'll do well." Mark nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." James glanced at him and smiled. I believe you will. They arrived at the property, a modest but well-maintained apartment building, and were greeted by Tony, the property manager. Tony was a stocky man in his 40s with a friendly demeanor and a clipboard perpetually in hand. So you're the new recruit, Tony said, extending a hand to Mark. Name's Tony. Don't worry, kid, we'll start you off easy. Mark shook Tony's hand firmly. Nice to meet you. I'm ready to work. Tony handed Mark the clipboard. Great attitude. Let's get started. First task, a leaky faucet in Unit 3B. I'll show you where the tools are. By midday, Mark was elbow-deep in repairs. The leaky faucet had been followed by a broken light fixture, which led to sweeping the stairwell and clearing out debris from the basement. The work was tiring, but Mark found a rhythm in it. For the first time in days, his mind wasn't consumed by the rent notice or his mother's weary eyes. He was doing something tangible, something that mattered. During a break, Tony handed Mark a bottle of water and sat down beside him on the front steps. You're doing good, kid. Most people your age wouldn't stick with it like this. Mark shrugged, taking a sip of water. I don't really have a choice. My family's counting on me. Tony nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. That's a lot of weight to carry. But let me tell you something, hard work like this, it doesn't go unnoticed. Keep it up, and you'll go far. Mark felt a swell of pride at Tony's words. Thanks. I'll do my best. By the time James returned in the late afternoon, Mark was covered in sweat and dust but wore a satisfied smile. James stepped out of the SUV and looked around, noting the clean stairwell and repaired light fixtures. Looks like you've been busy, James said, nodding approvingly. How'd it go? Mark wiped his hands on his jeans. Good. Hard work, but good. James handed Mark an envelope. Your first day's pay. You earned it. Mark hesitated before taking it, the weight of the envelope both physical and symbolic. Thanks. This means a lot. James smiled. You earned it. And if you're up for it, we'd love to have you back tomorrow. Mark nodded. I'll be here. That evening, Mark walked into his home with the envelope in hand. His mother looked up from the kitchen table, her face a mix of curiosity and concern. How is it? She asked. Mark set the envelope on the table and opened it, revealing a modest stack of bills. His mother's eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth. This is your pay? She whispered. Mark nodded. Yeah. It's not much, but it's a start. His mother picked up the money, her fingers trembling. Mark, this is more than I expected. Thank you. Mark smiled, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little lighter. We'll get through this, Ma. One step at a time. That night, for the first time in weeks, the Daniels family ate a proper meal. The tension in the air was still there, but it had softened, replaced by a glimmer of hope. Mark went to bed exhausted but content, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The sun hung high in the sky as Mark arrived at James's apartment complex for his first day on the job. He felt a nervous energy bubbling under his skin. The building's facade was neatly painted, and the lawn was meticulously trimmed, a stark contrast to the weathered homes in his own neighborhood. Tony, the building manager, greeted Mark with a warm smile and a firm handshake. Welcome, kid. Ready to work? Tony asked, handing Mark a clipboard filled with tasks. Mark nodded, gripping the clipboard tightly. Yes, sir. Tony chuckled. No need for sir. Just Tony is fine. Let's get started. The list was long and varied, everything from fixing leaky faucets to repainting scuffed walls. Mark rolled up his sleeves and dove in. His first task took him to a tenant's apartment where a dripping faucet had been causing frustration for weeks. With Tony's guidance, Mark learned how to replace a worn-out washer. As he worked, the tenant, a kind elderly woman, watched with approval. You're doing good work, young man, she said, smiling. Nice to see someone who's not afraid to get their hands dirty. Mark felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. Thank you, ma'am. By midday, Mark had completed 3 tasks from the list, and his muscles were beginning to protest. Tony noticed and handed him a bottle of water. You're doing great, Mark, Tony said, clapping him on the shoulder. Take a break when you need it. This isn't a race. Mark nodded, grateful for the encouragement. Thanks. I'll keep going. I want to get as much done as I can. Tony's eyes softened. That's a good attitude, kid. But remember, pacing yourself is part of the job too. As the afternoon wore on, Mark found himself painting the walls of a hallway that had seen better days. The rhythmic motion of the brush against the wall was oddly calming. He found himself reflecting on the changes in his life over the past few days. This job wasn't just about the money, it was about proving to himself and his family that he could rise above their circumstances. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, Mark's clothes were speckled with paint, and his arms ached from the physical labor. He'd completed more tasks than he thought possible in one day. Tony met him in the lobby, a look of approval on his face. You've done a great job, Mark, Tony said, handing him an envelope. Here's your pay for the day. You've earned it. Mark took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It wasn't just money, it was proof that he could make a difference for his family. He smiled. Thank you, Tony. I'll be back tomorrow. Tony grinned. I'm looking forward to it. You've got potential, kid. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. At home, Mark placed the envelope on the kitchen table in front of his mom. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes wide with surprise. Is this, she began, her voice faltering. Mark nodded. It's from the job. I'll be working every day after school. This should help with the rent. Tears welled in her eyes as she pulled Mark into a tight hug. Oh, Mark. You don't know how much this means to us. Mark hugged her back, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and relief. We're going to be okay, Ma. I promise. The days turned into weeks, and Mark's routine became a steady rhythm of school, work, and home. Each day brought new challenges, a broken heater, a clogged drain, a squeaky door, but Mark tackled each one with determination. Tony continued to mentor him, teaching him not just the skills of the trade but also life lessons that Mark knew he'd carry with him forever. Life's going to throw a lot of curveballs at you, Mark, Tony said one afternoon as they repaired a tenant's window. The trick isn't dodging them, it's learning how to catch him and throw him back. Mark chuckled. Sounds easier said than done. Tony grinned. It is. But you're smart. You'll figure it out. One day, as Mark was repainting a stairwell, a tenant approached him with a warm smile. You've been doing a lot around here, she said. It's nice to see someone taking pride in their work. Mark wiped his hands on a rag and smiled. Thanks. I'm just trying to help out. The tenant nodded. Well, it's appreciated. Keep it up, young man. Moments like these reminded Mark why he was doing this. Every task he completed, every kind word he received, was a step towards securing a better future for his family. By the end of the month, Mark's confidence had grown. He was no longer just a boy struggling under the weight of his family's problems. He was a worker, a provider, and a problem solver. The doubts and whispers from the neighborhood felt smaller now, their weight no longer crushing. Mark knew who he was and what he was capable of. One evening, as he and Tony locked up for the day, Tony handed Mark a folded piece of paper. What's this? Mark asked, unfolding it. A letter of recommendation, Tony said with a grin. You've earned it. If you ever need it for another job or school, it's all yours. Mark stared at the paper, a lump forming in his throat. Thank you, Tony. For everything. Tony clapped him on the shoulder. You're going places, kid. I'm just glad I got to see you start your journey. underscore 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 underscore. That night, as Mark sat at the kitchen table counting his pay, his mother joined him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes shining with pride. "You've grown so much, Mark," she said softly. "I'm so proud of you." Mark looked up at her, his heart full. "Thanks, Ma. But this is just the beginning." As they sat together, the weight of their struggles felt lighter. Mark knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever challenges came next. Together, they would build a better future, one step, one task, one day at a time. The whispers started as soon as the black SUV began frequenting their block. It wasn't long before everyone in the neighborhood seemed to have an opinion about Mark and his sudden connection to the man in the shiny car. Some were curious, others suspicious, but none more vocal than Mr. Johnson, the grumpy old man who lived 2 houses down. Mark's day had been long and grueling. He'd spent hours scrubbing scuffed walls and patching a stubborn leak in one of the older apartments. The work left his hands raw, his back aching, and his mind focused on little more than getting home and collapsing into bed. But as he walked up the street that evening, the familiar growl of Mr. Johnson's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Look who it is," Johnson sneered from his porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Our local hotshot. Riding in that fancy car, thinking he's too good for the rest of us." Mark paused, his fists clenching at his sides. He wanted to fire back, to tell the old man he didn't know anything about the struggles his family was facing. But he bit his tongue and kept walking, head down and jaw tight. "Yeah, that's right," Johnson called after him. "Keep your head down, boy. Won't be long before your little arrangement blows up in your face. People like him don't help people like us for free." Mark's ears burned, but he forced himself to keep moving. As he reached his front door, he stopped to take a deep breath, willing the anger to subside. He didn't want his mom to see him upset, she had enough to worry about already. Inside, the scent of stew simmering on the stove filled the air, and the sound of his younger siblings laughing in the living room brought a faint smile to his face. His mom was at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables with a weary but determined expression. "Hey, sweetheart," she greeted him, glancing up. Her smile faded as she noticed his slumped shoulders and furrowed brow. "What happened?" Mark hesitated, then shook his head. "It's nothing. Just neighbors talking." Her knife paused mid-chop, and she sighed. "Let me guess. Mr. Johnson?" Mark nodded, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "He thinks I'm some kind of sellout for working with James. Like I'm doing something wrong just because I'm trying to help us stay afloat." His mom set the knife down and wiped her hands on a towel before turning to face him. "People like Mr. Johnson have spent their whole lives being beaten down. They've learned to expect the worst from everyone, even when someone's just trying to do good. Don't let his bitterness get to you." "It's not just him, Ma," Mark said quietly. "I can feel it every time I walk down the street. The stares, the whispers, they think I'm doing something shady. They don't understand what we're going through." She stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. "They don't have to understand, Mark. The only thing that matters is what we're doing for each other. You're working hard, doing honest work, and helping your family. That's nothing to be ashamed of." Mark nodded, though the knot in his chest didn't entirely ease. He knew she was right, but the weight of the judgment still clung to him like a shadow. The next morning, Mark decided to leave for work earlier than usual. The street was quieter at this hour, with most neighbors still asleep or just beginning their day. As he walked, he tried to focus on the positives. The rent was paid, his siblings were fed, and his mom seemed a little less worried. But the doubts lingered, fueled by the cutting words of people like Mr. Johnson. When Mark arrived at the apartment building, Tony was already there, leaning against the maintenance closet door with a cup of coffee in hand. He greeted Mark with a nod and a grin. "Morning, kid. Ready for another day of hard labor?" Mark managed a smile. "Always." Tony handed him a clipboard with the day's tasks. "You're doing good work, Mark. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Mark glanced at him, surprised. "You hear people talking too?" Tony's grin faded, replaced by a serious expression. "This neighborhood, people like to gossip. But let me tell you something, most of them are just scared. They see someone trying to get ahead, and it makes them question why they haven't done the same. Don't take it personally." Mark nodded, though the words didn't fully sink in. He appreciated Tony's support, but it was hard to ignore the sting of the whispers when they followed him everywhere. By midday, Mark was painting the stairwell, his mind drifting as the rhythmic motion of the brush lulled him into a sort of trance. The sound of footsteps snapped him back to reality, and he looked up to see one of the tenants, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a skeptical expression, watching him. "You the new maintenance kid?" she asked, crossing her arms. Mark nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Her gaze narrowed. "You work for that James Howard, don't you? The guy who bought this place?" "I do," Mark replied, keeping his tone polite. She huffed, shaking her head. "Just be careful. People like him don't do anything out of the goodness of their hearts." Mark's grip tightened on the paintbrush, but he forced a calm response. "I'm just here to do my job, ma'am. Nothing more." She studied him for a moment longer before walking away, her muttered words barely audible but clearly unkind. Mark exhaled slowly, willing himself to stay focused on his work. That evening, James arrived to check on Mark's progress. As they walked through the building, James noticed the tension in Mark's posture. "Everything okay?" James asked. Mark hesitated, then shrugged. "Just people talking. They don't trust you, and by extension, they don't trust me." James's expression softened. "Mark, you can't control what other people think. All you can do is focus on what you're doing and why you're doing it. You're helping your family, and that's what matters." Mark nodded, though the words offered only partial comfort. "It's just hard, you know? Feeling like everyone's against you." James placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than you realize, Mark. Keep your head up. You're doing good work, and eventually, people will see that." Mark managed a small smile. "Thanks, James." When Mark got home that night, his mom was waiting for him on the porch. She looked up as he approached, her face etched with concern. "Rough day?" she asked. Mark sank onto the step beside her and let out a long sigh. "People just don't know when to quit. They think I'm up to something shady because of James." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "They don't know you, Mark. They don't see the sacrifices you're making for this family. But I do. And I'm proud of you." Her words, spoken with quiet conviction, eased the weight on his shoulders. Mark looked at her and smiled faintly. "Thanks, Ma." They sat in silence for a while, the cool night air wrapping around them. For the first time that day, Mark felt a flicker of peace. He didn't know if the whispers would ever stop, but as long as his family believed in him, he could keep going. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple as the day gave way to evening. Mark had just finished repairing a door hinge in one of the units when he heard James's familiar voice echoing down the hallway. "Mark," James called, his tone warm and encouraging. "You've been busy, haven't you?" Mark turned, wiping his hands on his worn jeans, and nodded. "Yeah, just trying to keep up." James approached with a relaxed confidence, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Behind him, Tony leaned casually against the wall, a small smile on his face. "Tony here tells me you've been doing excellent work," James said, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. "I knew you had it in you." Mark felt a wave of pride wash over him. He glanced at Tony, who nodded in agreement. "You're a quick learner, kid. And you've got something a lot of people don't these days, grit. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp envelope. He held it out to Mark. Here's your paycheck for this week. You've earned every cent of it. Mark hesitated before taking the envelope, the weight of it both literal and symbolic in his hands. He'd worked tirelessly, not just for the money but for the sense of purpose it gave him. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I mean it. Thank you for giving me a chance. James's smile widened. Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning, Mark. You're proving to everyone, including yourself, that you're capable of great things. Tony clapped Mark on the back. Keep it up, kid. You're making us all look good. As James and Tony walked away, Mark remained in the hallway, staring at the envelope in his hand. He could feel the weight of the money inside, but it was the validation that mattered more. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't just surviving, he was building something. When Mark arrived home later that evening, his mom was in the kitchen, her back turned as she stirred a pot of stew. The smell of simmering vegetables and spices filled the air, a rare treat for their family. Hey, Ma, Mark said, setting his backpack on the floor. She turned, wiping her hands on a towel. You're home late. Everything okay? Mark nodded and held out the envelope. I got paid today. It's enough to cover the rent and maybe even a little extra. Her eyes widened as she took the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. She opened it and counted the bills, her expression shifting from disbelief to relief. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at Mark. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. You have no idea what this means to us. Mark hugged her back, his throat tight. I just want to help, Ma. That's all I want. She pulled back, cupping his face in her hands. You're doing more than helping. You're giving us hope. Mark's little brother and sister, Danny and Mia, peeked around the corner, their curious faces lighting up when they saw the envelope. Did you get us something, Mark? Danny asked, his eyes wide with excitement. Mark chuckled and ruffled his brother's hair. Not yet, but maybe this weekend we can get some ice cream. How about that? The kids cheered, their laughter filling the small kitchen. Mark's mom smiled, her tired face softening in a way Mark hadn't seen in months. For the first time, it felt like their family was beginning to move forward. The next morning, Mark decided to visit the market to pick up a few things. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was crisp with the promise of a new day. As he walked through the bustling stalls, he spotted Mr. Howard sitting on a bench, feeding crumbs to a flock of pigeons. Mr. Howard, Mark called out, approaching him with a smile. The old man looked up, his face breaking into a grin. Mark! Good to see you, son. How's the family? Better, Mark said, sitting down beside him. I got a job thanks to your son. Things are finally starting to look up. Mr. Howard nodded, his eyes twinkling. That's what I like to hear. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Mark. And a good heart, too. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. They talked for a while, the conversation easy and warm. Before Mark left, Mr. Howard pressed a few bills into his hand. Buy something nice for your family, he said with a wink. And don't argue with an old man. Mark laughed and pocketed the money. Thank you, Mr. Howard. For everything. As he walked home, Mark felt a sense of gratitude that went beyond words. He had started this journey unsure of himself and uncertain of the future. But now, with the support of people like James, Tony, and Mr. Howard, he was beginning to see what was possible. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Mark's mom brought out a small cake she'd managed to buy with the extra money. What's this? Mark asked, his eyes widening in surprise. A celebration, she said, setting the cake on the table. For all of us. For getting through the tough times and for what's to come. Danny and Mia clapped excitedly, their faces smeared with icing as they dug into their slices. Mark couldn't help but smile as he watched them. This was what he had been working for, to see his family happy and together. After dinner, Mark stepped outside and sat on the porch. The stars were just beginning to dot the night sky, their light faint but steady. His mom joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You've grown so much these past few weeks," she said softly. "I'm so proud of you, Mark." He looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you, Ma. Everything I do is for this family." She reached over and took his hand in hers. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart. Thanks to you." As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. There were still challenges ahead, but for now, they had hope. And that was enough. The aroma of roasted chicken and fresh-baked bread filled the small kitchen, a rare luxury in the Daniels household. Mark's mom had spared no effort in turning their modest dinner into a celebration. For the first time in months, the table was set with mismatched but carefully cleaned plates, and even the smallest details, like napkins folded into triangles, reflected the joy of the evening. Mark sat at the head of the table, flanked by his younger siblings, Danny and Mia. Their eyes sparkled with anticipation as they peered at the spread before them: chicken seasoned to perfection, buttery mashed potatoes, and a colorful assortment of vegetables. For once, there were no shadows of worry in their mother's eyes, only pride and relief. "This is amazing, Ma," Mark said, glancing at her. She stood at the counter, finishing the last touches on the meal. Her smile was radiant yet restrained, as if she feared allowing herself too much joy. "You deserve it, sweetheart," she replied. "We all do." As everyone settled into their seats, Mark's mom raised her glass of water. "To family," she said. Her voice cracked slightly, but her eyes remained steady. "And to Mark, for reminding us that no matter how hard things get, we can make it through together." A chorus of "to Mark" echoed around the table, followed by the clinking of glasses and cups. Mark felt his cheeks flush, but he couldn't help smiling. For once, he allowed himself to bask in the moment. As the dinner unfolded, laughter filled the room. Danny and Mia competed to tell the funniest stories from school, their cheerful voices a stark contrast to the subdued tones that had dominated the house for months. Mark's mom chimed in with anecdotes from her childhood, her laughter ringing out like a melody Mark hadn't heard in years. "Remember when you tried to cook spaghetti that one time?" Mia teased Mark, her grin mischievous. "You burned the noodles and the sauce." Mark groaned, rubbing his temples dramatically. "Hey, I was 12, okay? I've gotten better." "Sure you have," Danny teased, snickering. Their mom's laughter joined theirs. "Well, at least now you know how to bring home a paycheck instead of a burnt dinner." The playful ribbing made Mark's chest swell with warmth. The darkness that had loomed over their family felt like it was finally lifting, piece by piece. After the plates were cleared and the last crumbs of dessert, a store-bought chocolate cake, were devoured, Mark's mom gestured for him to follow her to the small living room. She sat on the worn sofa, patting the cushion beside her. The dim light from a nearby lamp cast a soft glow on her face, highlighting the lines of worry that were beginning to fade. "Mark," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "I need to tell you something." He sat down, his posture attentive. "What is it, Ma?" She reached over and took his hand, her grip warm and steady. "You've done more for this family than I ever could have asked. You stepped up when we needed you most. And I want you to know how proud I am of you. Not just for the money you brought home, but for the man you're becoming." Mark's throat tightened. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words. "We're a team, Ma," he said after a moment. "Always." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she nodded. "Always." The following morning, the house buzzed with a renewed sense of purpose. Mark woke up to the sound of Mia humming as she braided her hair and Danny clanging bowls in the kitchen. He stretched and got ready for the day, feeling lighter than he had in months. As he entered the kitchen, he saw his mom carefully counting the money he had earned. She looked up and smiled. This will cover the next month's rent, she said. And we'll even have a little left over for savings. Mark poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Good. We need a cushion, just in case. His mom's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of determination. Mark, I've been thinking. It's time I find another job. Something steadier, with better pay. He raised an eyebrow. You're already working so hard, Ma. Are you sure? She nodded. I'm sure. What you've done has bought us time, but I need to do my part, too. We're in this together, remember? Mark couldn't argue with that. All right. But don't push yourself too hard. We've got this under control for now. She reached out and ruffled his hair, something she hadn't done since he was a kid. Don't worry about me, sweetheart. Just focus on school and your work with James. Later that day, Mark met James at the apartment building for another shift. James greeted him with a smile. How's the family? Better, Mark replied. Thanks to you. James shook his head. Thanks to you, Mark. You're the one putting in the work. As they walked through the building, James pointed out a few areas that needed attention. I've been thinking, he said after a while. You've got a knack for this kind of work. Ever thought about turning it into something more long-term? Mark blinked. Like what? A trade, James suggested. Plumbing, carpentry, electrical work. Skilled labor like that can lead to a stable career. I'd be happy to help you get started. Mark considered the idea. He'd never thought much about his future beyond getting through the next month. But James's suggestion planted a seed in his mind. I'll think about it, he said. James clapped him on the shoulder. That's all I ask. You've got potential, Mark. Don't let it go to waste. That evening, Mark shared James's idea with his mom. She listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. It's a good idea, she said finally. But don't rush into anything. Take your time to figure out what you really want. Mark nodded. I will. But it's nice to know there are options. She smiled. Options are a blessing, Mark. And you've worked hard to earn them. As the days turned into weeks, life began to settle into a new normal. The rent was paid on time, the pantry was stocked, and the laughter that had once been scarce now filled the house daily. Mark continued working with James and learning from Tony, building both his skills and his confidence. One evening, as Mark sat on the porch, watching the stars, Mia joined him. She leaned against his shoulder, her small frame warm against his side. You're like a hero, you know, she said softly. You saved us. Mark chuckled, his cheeks flushing. I'm no hero, Mia. I just did what needed to be done. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with admiration. Maybe. But you're my hero anyway. Mark smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time, he truly believed that things were going to be okay. Together, they had weathered the storm. And together, they would keep moving forward. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of their modest home as Mark sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of weak coffee. His mother was already up, bustling around the small space, her movements lighter and more deliberate than they'd been in months. The weight of unpaid bills and overdue rent had been lifted, if only temporarily, and the family could finally breathe. But for Mark, the morning was tinged with a sense of unease. He had made a decision, one that had been brewing in his mind for days. Ma, he said, setting his cup down. His mother turned to face him, her eyes questioning. I've been thinking. It's time I look for something more permanent, a stable job. What James did for us, it's amazing, but I can't rely on him forever. We need something we can count on. She stared at him, her eyes softening. Mark, you've done so much for us already. Are you sure? You're just a kid, you should be focusing on school, not. I am focusing on us, Ma, he interrupted gently. This isn't forever. But I can't stop now. I've learned a lot working with James and Tony. I think I can find something that'll keep us moving forward. She sighed, nodding slowly. You're growing up too fast, Mark. But I'm proud of you. Just promise me you won't let this world make you bitter. Mark smiled faintly. I promise, Ma. Later that afternoon, Mark met with James at the apartment building. The sun shone brightly, reflecting off the polished black SUV parked outside. As Mark approached, James stepped out of the vehicle, his usual warm smile greeting him. Mark, James said, extending a hand. Good to see you. How's everything going? Mark shook his hand, his grip firm. Everything's good. That's actually why I wanted to talk to you. James tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Go on. Mark took a deep breath. I wanted to thank you. For everything. You've done more for me and my family than I can ever repay. But I think it's time for me to move on. I need to find something more stable, something that'll let us stand on our own 2 feet. James's smile faded slightly, replaced by an expression of understanding. He nodded. I've been expecting this. You're the kind of person who's always looking ahead. And you're right. Stability is important. I'm proud of you for recognizing that. Mark's chest tightened. This isn't about you, James. You gave me a chance when no one else would. I'll never forget that. James clapped a hand on Mark's shoulder. And I'll never forget you, Mark. You've got a bright future ahead of you. Don't let anyone hold you back. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp envelope. This is your final paycheck, he said. And something extra. Call it an investment in your future. Mark hesitated but accepted the envelope. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. As Mark walked home from their final meeting, a mix of sadness and pride washed over him. This chapter of his life was closing, but it had taught him invaluable lessons, the value of hard work, the importance of resilience, and the power of community. His neighbors may have doubted him, but he'd proved, to himself, his family, and the world, that he could rise above their whispers and judgment. The sound of children's laughter greeted him as he approached his house. Danny and Mia were playing in the front yard, their giggles carrying on the breeze. His mother stood on the porch, her arms crossed as she watched them with a soft smile. When she saw Mark, her smile widened. How'd it go? She asked. Mark climbed the steps and handed her the envelope. It's done, he said. This is the last one. From now on, I'm finding something steady. She opened the envelope, her eyes widening at the sight of the money inside. Mark, she whispered. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached out to hug him. You're incredible. I don't know what we'd do without you. Mark hugged her back, the warmth of her embrace chasing away the lingering doubts in his heart. We're a team, Ma. Always. That evening, they celebrated with a simple but hearty dinner. The table was filled with laughter and stories, the kind of moments that had been rare in their household for too long. For the first time in months, they felt like a family again, whole and unburdened. After dinner, Mark sat on the porch steps, gazing up at the stars. The cool night air was refreshing, a quiet contrast to the noise and chaos of the neighborhood. His mother joined him, sitting down with a contented sigh. You've grown so much these past few months, she said, her voice tinged with pride and sadness. It's like you've become a man overnight. Mark chuckled softly. I just did what needed to be done. We're here because of all of us, Ma. Not just me. She placed a hand on his shoulder. You've got a good heart, Mark. Don't ever lose that. No matter where life takes you. He nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a warm blanket. I won't, Ma. I promise. The next morning, Mark woke up early, a sense of determination propelling him out of bed. He had a plan, a list of places to visit, applications to fill out, and calls to make. He dressed quickly, laced up his sneakers, and grabbed a piece of toast before heading out. His first stop was a local hardware store where he'd heard they were looking for part-time help. The manager, a stocky man with a kind smile, looked over Mark's application and nodded approvingly. "You've got some experience with repairs and maintenance?" the manager asked. "Yes, sir," Mark replied confidently. "I've been working at an apartment complex for a few months now, handling all sorts of tasks. I'm a quick learner and not afraid of hard work." The manager smiled. "Sounds like you're just what we're looking for. Can you start tomorrow?" Mark's heart soared. "Absolutely. Thank you, sir." By the time Mark returned home, the sun was high in the sky. He found his mom in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared lunch. When he told her the news, her face lit up with pride. "See? I knew you'd find something," she said, pulling him into a hug. "You're going to do great, Mark." That night, as Mark lay in bed, he reflected on everything that had led him to this point. The struggles, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt and triumph, they had all shaped him into the person he was becoming. He didn't know what the future held, but he felt ready to face it head-on. Because now, he understood the power of resilience, the importance of community, and the strength that came from standing together as a family. And for Mark, that was more than enough. The summer breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers as Mark leaned back in his chair on the porch. The neighborhood, once a source of tension and judgment, now felt calmer, a reflection of the changes within his family. The evening sky glowed with hues of orange and pink, and the faint laughter of his siblings echoed from inside the house. It was a rare moment of peace, one Mark had worked tirelessly to achieve. Months had passed since he decided to leave the job with James and seek stability. His steady position at the local hardware store had brought a sense of security to their lives. The work was honest and predictable, and Mark found pride in mastering the skills the job required. He'd earned the respect of his coworkers, and his manager had even hinted at a promotion in the near future. For the first time in years, Mark felt like he was building a foundation for a brighter future. Every morning, Mark would rise before the sun, slipping out of the house quietly so as not to wake his mom or siblings. The walk to the hardware store was a time for reflection. He often thought about the challenges they'd faced and the people who had helped them along the way. James's words about potential still echoed in his mind, driving him to push harder and dream bigger. The job, though physically demanding, was rewarding. Mark quickly became the go-to employee for solving problems. Whether it was helping a customer find the right tools or repairing equipment in the backroom, he tackled every task with determination. His coworkers admired his work ethic, and their camaraderie made the long hours more bearable. The paycheck, while modest, was enough to cover the bills and put food on the table. Mark had even started saving for the future, a concept that once seemed like an unattainable luxury. His mom's face had lost the lines of worry that used to dominate her expression, replaced by a glow of relief and pride. Danny and Mia thrived in the stability, excelling in school and reveling in the small joys of childhood. The whispers from the neighborhood, once a constant source of tension, had faded into silence. People began to notice the changes in Mark and his family. Instead of judgment, they now offered nods of respect or stopped to chat briefly when they saw him. Mr. Johnson, the grumpy man down the street, even offered Mark a kind word one day, though it was begrudging and mumbled. Mark had also taken steps to give back to the community. On weekends, he volunteered at a local youth center, helping kids with homework or teaching them basic repair skills. It felt good to pass on the lessons he'd learned, to show them that hard work and determination could pave the way for better opportunities. "You're a good role model for these kids," said Mrs. Carter, the center's director. "They see someone who's been where they are and made it out. That's powerful." Mark's chest swelled with pride at her words. He hadn't set out to be anyone's role model, but if his story could inspire even one kid to believe in themselves, it was worth it. One evening, Mark came home to find his mom sitting at the kitchen table, going over the family budget. She looked up as he walked in, her smile warm and genuine. "Look at this," she said, sliding the paper toward him. "We're finally ahead on the rent." And there's enough left over to start a little savings account. Mark studied the numbers, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. That's great, Ma. We've come a long way. She reached across the table, taking his hand. We couldn't have done it without you, Mark. You've carried so much on your shoulders, and I'm so proud of the man you've become. Mark felt his throat tighten, but he managed to smile. We did it together, Ma. Always. Their conversation turned to the future. His mom spoke about her dreams of going back to school to finish the degree she put on hold years ago. Mark shared his own ambitions, including the possibility of opening his own repair business someday. The idea of creating something lasting, something he could pass down to Danny and Mia, filled him with hope. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark and his mom sat on the porch. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and the first stars began to twinkle. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the chirping of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog. Mark's mom took his hand, her grip firm but comforting. We made it, Mark. Together. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars. Yeah, we did. For a moment, they sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The struggles of the past felt like a distant memory, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. Mark knew there would still be challenges ahead, life was never easy, but he also knew they could face them as a family. Danny and Mia joined them on the porch, their laughter filling the air. They pointed out constellations, making up stories about the stars. Mark smiled, watching his siblings' faces light up with joy. This was what he had fought for, moments like this, where the weight of the world felt lighter, where hope shone brighter than any star. As the night deepened, Mark felt a profound sense of peace. They had weathered the storm and come out stronger. Whatever the future held, he knew they could handle it. Together, they were unstoppable.